put Zarqawi's picture on the big screen in front of the Security Council saying, here's Exhibit A. Here's the guy who's the link between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. So the Quran says you're not supposed to burn another person. It's very explicit in the Quran. Zarqawi didn't care. So we'd get somebody to say, well, under these circumstances, it's okay to do that. And by 2014, when ISIS was really at its peak, money was no object. They had more money than they could spend in any of their lifetimes. They had enough to run a government. The problem is he was such a hothead and he's such a thug that, Al-Qaeda looks at this guy and say, you're too crazy for us. But there are thousands and thousands of young people who grew up in the caliphate, who were born in the caliphate, who don't have a passport from anywhere else. And nobody knows what to do with them.
Back in 2010s, the world witnessed a meteoric rise of Islamic State, or ISIS, whose extreme violence and barbaric public executions made them a symbol of evil. ISIS seemingly came out of nowhere, and within a very short period of time, they took control over a territory the size of Denmark, Switzerland, and Belgium combined. However, what is not widely known in the mainstream is that the group's origin goes back to early 2000s and is tied to a Jordanian named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Joby Warrick, a journalist and a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, shared the story of Zarqawi and ISIS in great detail in his best-selling book Black Flags: The Rise of ISIS, which we are discussing in this interview. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe. And now we start. You spent quite a bit of time researching ISIS before it even became this global, I don't want to use it, phenomenon for these guys, but what was the most surprising thing for you? What did you learn about them? And is there anything still that you can't wrap your head around?
So much to unpack there, but really, I was giggling or snickering a little bit there just because one big surprise was how important they would become. Because I knew that this was an important group. I had followed them for years under different names, and we'll go into this, I'm sure, but they existed for a long time as Al-Qaida in Iraq, and they had a pedigree that went back to the Levant. And so there was a lot that I was fascinated by. I thought they were interesting and potentially dangerous. What was a big surprise for me as I was doing my work was for them to become a global phenomenon, that suddenly out of nowhere, this becomes a global menace and eclipsed Al-Qaeda, and still does to this day in certain degrees, because both groups are clearly on the wane, but it was just remarkable how quickly they came from being unknown to being, sort of terrorist superstars that we all reading about in the news, as horrible as that was. So that was one big surprise. And I guess the other thing, to be honest, is the degree of extremism, the kind of extremism, which I was never quite able to fully get my head around, because it's so hard to recognize as a human being how people can justify the kind of acts that ISIS committed and try to dress it up in some way as being religious. And to this day, and when I talk to people who are still in that world, they're non-repentant. They think that perhaps they went a little too far, to say the least, but they felt like they were doing the right thing. And some of them still think so. They just feel like maybe their tactics are wrong.
One other interesting thing to me, and then you mentioned here that the origin of ISIS, like to me, ISIS always was associated with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But the story goes back to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, right? Who is that character and who is that person and what was his background?
Well, he's a very important person to understand if you want to understand the Islamic State, because, we all kind of came to learn about this group at the time it was being headed by an Iraqi Baghdadi who was cruel and evil and all kinds of horrible things that we can say about him now that he's in the rearview mirror. But the story of ISIS and the reason it became as twisted and as vicious as it is as a movement has less to do with those more modern characters than with this person who was sort of the godfather of the Islamic State. His name was Zarqawi. That was his nom de guerre. He was known throughout his life, throughout his career, as Abu Musab Zarqawi. And he was, very different from all the other sort of Islamist figures that we think about. Very different from bin Laden and Zawahiri and even Baghdadi, in the sense that he was not an educated man. He was a kind of a thug from the street in this town in Jordan. He had a sort of middle class, bureaucratic family back in Zarqa, in the town that he came from. But he was a misfit, a ne'er-do-well. He was involved early in violence as a child, and gangs, drug use, had tattoos. Was a young monster in the making, and then becomes a holy warrior, decides to take the call to, from Al-Qaida at the time to go fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. He gets there too late to fight the Soviets, but he becomes, part of that this environment of mujahideen fighters who are often in the hills in Afghanistan trying to fight the Afghan government. And that's where this brutal, thuggish character becomes something with an additional layer of a religious zeal and commitment to try to bring jihad throughout the Middle East and perhaps even beyond that.
What's mujahideen for people who don't know?
So it really means essentially holy warriors. And it's an ancient term in a sense, but in the modern context, this was the name that was associated with the Muslim warriors who were fighting the Soviets back when the Soviet Union took over Afghanistan. A communist government was installed that was an anathema to fundamentalist Muslims around the world. And so you saw this period in the 70s and 80s where it wasn't just sort of Afghan tribes fighting the government and fighting the Soviets, but this sort of band of Muslim brothers, literally, people from around the world coming to Afghanistan to help sort of fight the infidel and to do it from a religious perspective. This is our religious duty, is to protect our brother Muslims and to push out these infidels out of our lands. And this was the environment that gave us Al-Qaida. Bin Laden, came up through this network. He became a leader of this movement, and others as well, including pretty much a whole who's who of everybody we know in Al-Qaida, and a lot of the folks who came up as Islamic State as well, including Zarqawi. He was part of that period in that movement.
When Soviets left, how did mujahideen were able to justify their actions against other Muslims in Afghan government? They would call them infidels as well.
It all got very complicated, and as our listeners who know this history a bit might remember. So, it was the Soviets left, and then who do you fight? Who's the enemy now? Well, for a while, it was the Soviet-backed puppet government in Kabul, as they saw it. But and then after that government collapsed, then it became just essentially a warlord struggle between factions in the West and the East and the North and the South, and the country was torn apart, driven back into the Stone Age practically, and for reasons that for the rest of the world, even for Afghans, I'm sure, were never very clear. It was a very intertribal war with everybody claiming to be on the same side in terms of Allah is with us, but all managing to take different points of view and just becoming at war with one another. And Zarqawi, as a young man who was part of this environment, eventually got fed up himself and went home. And eventually, as we know, the Taliban ends up being the victors. And the Taliban opens an invitation to Osama bin Laden to be our guest, to stay with us and have your little network or your the center of your movement here among us.
So Zarqawi goes back to Jordan, right? And somehow he ended up al-Jafr. Walk us through that story and what happened in al-Jafr.
So you can imagine all these young mujahideen hotheads like Zarqawi. He wasn't the only one. There was many of these young youths. Basically, they were young men who were of fighting age who got caught up in this movement, come back to Jordan, which is a fairly tranquil place. It's a place with a stable government. They're fairly Western in their orientation, and it's a stifling place. Yet somehow, just like a lot of veterans coming home from a conflict, they don't fit in anymore. They don't seem to have a purpose, and so they begin to reorganize and try to find ways to keep this jihadi energy going at home. And they do little things like, raiding or just bombing liquor stores. Or in one case, it's somewhat humorous, but one of them got an idea to blow up a pornographic cinema in their hometown. And so they get the bomb together, they pick the recruit, the guy's going to go in there and set the bomb and blow it up. But, then the movie comes on, it's a porno film, and he gets completely engrossed in it, forgets about the bomb, which blows up and blows off his feet, unfortunately for him. He survives, nobody else really gets hurt, but these are the kinds of, idiots and, small timers that are running, Zarqawi's world at the time. But anyway, the Jordanian government is very aware that this is a poison. This is a really big potential problem for the country. So they're trying to squash this young movement. And so they all get rounded up, including Zarqawi, and get herded off to a remote part of Jordan into an old prison, which gets reopened just for the purpose of warehousing these young radicals and keeping them away from the rest of the prison population. And so that's where Zarqawi is in 1999, just in prison for a 15-year sentence. We probably should have never heard of him again. And then circumstances changed in the Middle East and in the world, and everything changes all at once.
What happens in that al-Jafr prison where they basically have this whole group of like-minded people sitting together, right? Mm. And they also have Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi with them, right? Yes. Who's that character, and what was his relationship with al-Zarqawi?
So you have this kind of unit of young men who are all in the same boat together. They're all kind of committed, to the same cause and sort of living this life of, shared privation in this prison at Jafr. And within this little universe, there are two leaders. One is Maqdisi, the one that you mentioned. He's a scholarly character. He's not a fighter by any means. He hasn't been out in the street, blowing up things, but he's sort of the brains of the operation. He's the one that kind of gives everyone religious instruction. It helps explain, why this cause is the right one from a theological point of view. And then you've got this other guy who emerges as a leader, and that's Zarqawi, who has military experience in the sense he's been off to Afghanistan and fighting. He's got street cred because he's this tough guy with, scars to prove it, tattoos. He has the swagger of a young gangster. And he becomes the enforcer. He becomes the guy that carries out the rules and makes sure that everybody's like not watching Western programs on the TV and praying those certain times of day. But what emerges from this period is Zarqawi is a natural leader. He's very charismatic. His followers adore him, and they would follow him to the ends of the earth. And some of them actually did that.
There is a period where you discussed when King of Jordan Abdullah comes to power. So what's interesting about this character and what happened when he comes to power, particularly with Zarqawi and the group?
So there's one major event that happens. It's purely historical accident. But the king of Jordan, this is the present king's father. His name is King Hussein. He was a very old man. He was sick with cancer, and in 1999 he dies. And it's this huge transformative moment for this small kingdom. And there's a historical tradition in Jordan when the sovereign passes away, there's a period of amnesty. A general amnesty is granted to political prisoners mostly. But in Jordan, it's a very tribal society still. The tribal leaders have, their own, favors to collect. And so a list is put together of people who will be granted freedom because of the king's passing. And the list ends up being, a couple thousand names. And on that list is Zarqawi, who ends up getting a free pass to walk out of prison as still a young man. And as I said before, the world may never have heard of Zarqawi had it not been for this event. But suddenly he's free to go. And he goes right back to where he started. He goes back to Afghanistan to restart his movement. And kind of our story goes on from there.
And tell me a little bit about al-Qaida of Iraq.
So what happens when Zarqawi gets out of prison is that he wants to reunite with al-Qaida proper, with bin Laden and his heroes. The problem is he was such a hothead and he's such a thug that, al-Qaida looks at this guy and say, you're too crazy for us. So we're not going to let you join our group. Thanks for asking. But they said, you can stay in Afghanistan if you want to. Well, here's a little area over in Herat in the far west of the country. You can set up a camp there. You can have your own thing. And so Zarqawi does that. He sets up a little, his own little terrorist movement out in the western part of Zarqawi. Long story short, fast forwarding a few years, there's 9/11 happens. The U.S. goes to war against the Taliban. Al-Qaida flees. They're on the run. But Zarqawi, being in his own little world, decides just to hop across the border from Afghanistan to the mountainous area between Iraq and Iran. It's sort of a no man's land, very remote, very isolated, but it's the place where he can essentially, regrow his movement away from prying eyes in relative safety because it's just so isolated. And this becomes the kernel of what later became Al-Qaida in Iraq. It didn't call itself that at the time, but the one sort of instigating factor that makes this group grow from obscurity to something really important was the U.S. invasion in 2003, which Zarqawi figured was going to happen. After 9/11, he's looking around their neighborhood. He says, absolutely, the Americans are going to come to Iraq. They're going to invade, and I'm going to be ready for them because I have been anointed by Allah to be this holy warrior fighting a superpower. And that's what I'm going to do when the Americans come. They're going to show up in Baghdad. I'm going to be there to meet them, and this is going to be my destiny. And his group ends up becoming called Al-Qaida in Iraq, which was essentially identifying it as a sort of a franchise, the first franchise of Al-Qaida proper, but always with the understanding this is Zarqawi's gang and they're going to do what they want to do.
You discuss in the book that Zarqawi surrounded himself with Islamic scholars who would found a way to justify his atrocities, like killing innocent people, right? Tell me a little bit more about that. How did he do it, and like what was the purpose of it?
Well, as we mentioned, Zarqawi was a guy from the street, and he was not just a thug and a kind of a gangsterish figure. He was ignorant. He had not finished high school. He dropped out. So his grasp of theology, let's say, was just very, very tenuous. But he also was kind of practical enough to understand that it'll help me a lot if people think that I'm, doing what God wants me to do. And it doesn't much matter if it's really what the Quran says or not, because it's what I say. And in order to kind of pull that off with his followers, he very smartly surrounded himself by a few Islamic scholars, people who were imams, had sort of the title, but they, weren't necessarily part of the mainstream. And he essentially encouraged them to sanction whatever he decided to do. So the Quran says you're not supposed to burn another person. It's very explicit in the Quran. Zarqawi didn't care. So he would get somebody to say, well, under these circumstances, it's okay to do that. Or it's not okay. The Quran, says you can't kill Muslim innocents, women and children, which Zarqawi did all the time. But he would manage to get someone to bless that action and to kind of justify it, sanctify it, say it's okay to do it because of these reasons, and just come up with something. And that was the Zarqawi method. And what's important about that is that becomes the way that ISIS operates later. And it turns out, other religious texts have this issue too, that you can find a piece of text, a sentence, if it's not in the Quran, maybe it's in one of the other writings, the Hadith, which are sort of the teachings of the prophets. You'll find something that you can grab and say, well, look, this is our loophole. We're allowed to do this because of X, Y, and Z. It was a very clever, very shrewd manipulation of essentially taking the little bit of religion that Zarqawi did know and then turning it into something that was kind of a weapon for him and a way to make himself look more important and look like somebody who was doing God's bidding instead of just a thug shooting things up.
There is a passage from the book that I would ask you to read. It's about the black flags. Could you please?
In the prophetic passages of the Muslim holy text known as the Hadith, Zarqawi saw his fate foretold. He and his men were black-clad soldiers, of whom the ancient scholars had written, quote, "The black flags will come from the east, led by mighty men with long hair and beards, with surnames taken from their hometowns. These conquerors would not merely reclaim the ancient Muslim lands, they would also be the instigators of the final cataclysmic struggle ending in the destruction of the West's great armies in northern Syria."
I find this passage fascinating because clearly there are black flags, there are long hair and beards, there are surnames coming from the hometowns like Baghdadi and Zarqawi. Do you think Zarqawi truly believed that he was chosen one, or he just cleverly reverse engineered this particular situation in order to attract followers?
That's a good question. And I think, Asnar, to be honest, it's a little of both. I think Zarqawi was shrewd enough that he realized that these kinds of images, these kind of appeals to this moment of pride, in the collective Muslim past, when there was it truly was a caliphate, and it was a huge thing, and people around that part of the world essentially followed the same religion, and the caliph sort of appeals to things like those black, outfits and the long hair and the beards and the names of where people came from, that all kind of resonated with young men who were excited about the idea of recreating this global Muslim project. And so that was, I think, a very deliberate and very shrewd bit of marketing. How do you get people to think that this is the real thing? Well, we're going to sprinkle in all these historic images that mean a lot to young Muslims, and we're going to, surround ourselves or cloak ourselves in this kind of imagery. But the other thing is that Zarqawi over time really believed his own PR, and especially toward the end of his life, as he was becoming more and more successful as a true terrorist figure, as an international terrorist figure, he saw himself as divinely anointed. And he would talk about that. He would say, I am the spark. I am the guy that gets this thing moving. And so two parts, he set it up very cleverly to get people to follow him. And then after a while, he thought, well, this really is true. I'm so successful. This can only be because God has tapped me to do this job.
You mentioned that he foresaw U.S. invading Iraq. In the book, you actually talk about this story where Rumsfeld is pushing very hard to find the link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. Why did U.S. wanted to invade Iraq that much? What was there?
Yeah, it was a period of history for Americans that I think we'll go back for years and decades and try to figure out how we managed to get ourselves into some of the messes that we did. Some of it was clearly overreaction. The U.S. got struck by a terrorist group in a way that we've never been struck in our history. So it was a collective sense of grief and a need for revenge and retribution. And then that gets caught up in all these other agendas that various groups had, including, this group of neoconservatives in the White House at the time who felt that, well, what we really want to do, we've always wanted to do, was to push out Saddam Hussein because we want to finish the business that didn't get quite finished in the first Gulf War. So I think the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was convinced early on that it wanted to add Iraq to the list of countries that it was going to fight in, the list of causes to get behind. And it needed a reason to do it because there was no, UN recognizable, legal justification for going in. And so they, essentially found two shreds of two storylines that would justify an invasion. And we know those. One was the WMD claim. We just put blinders on and essentially believe things that didn't exist in that case. The other thing was possible connection between Saddam Hussein, the secular dictator, and Al-Qaeda. That the idea that these two were working together, they were, conspiring together, and that made both of them more dangerous. But there was really no evidence of any kind of link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And in fact, if you look at the history of these two, they didn't get along very well at all. Saddam Hussein would arrest and imprison and kill, religious radicals in his country, people he saw as radicals and troublemakers. And so you don't see Al-Qaeda in Iraq in any significant way. The only exception is Zarqawi happens to be physically in Iraq because this is where he fled to after the fall of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. He just happens to be there. And so the Bush administration, tries to collect little bits of evidence that would suggest that Zarqawi is this middleman, that he's the one who's the go-between between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And it was tenuous at best. Pretty much the best they could come up with was the fact that they had seen Iraqi intelligence officials kind of checking out Zarqawi, trying to meet with them, conducting surveillance, but they were like us, trying to figure out what he was doing. There was no evidence that two ever got along together, but it was just enough of a thread that Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, goes before the UN in February of 2002 and makes a case for a U.S. invasion, and he puts Zarqawi's picture on the big screen in front of the Security Council, saying, here's Exhibit A. Here's the guy who's the link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And it was the thinnest possible read. It turned out to be not there at all. There was no connection, but it was enough to justify an invasion for the Americans.
But that also gave a boost to the persona of Zarqawi, right?
Irony of it all is it made Zarqawi to be the important person that he always thought that he was. And he made him important in the eyes of the international jihadist community, who suddenly see, oh, wow, this is the guy the Americans think is really important. He must be a real big deal. As I was actually working as a reporter at the time, covering this stuff in real time, and we'd never heard of Zarqawi. And there are a lot of people going off to looking up their clip files, and some people who are in the Middle East, they went and found his mother and say, well, who's this Zarqawi person? And his mother was saying, well, he can't be doing all that. He's not that smart. And so we all were just kind of completely baffled by this person. But in a way, by making him a big deal, he became one. And because the Americans said he was important, a lot of people felt that he was worth following. Big irony of history there.
I found it also interesting where they put the same bounty for him as for bin Laden. What is it, 25 million? Something like that. They put him on the same. But
what a nice little pat on the back for this young man. So he was barely 33, I think, at the time. So still quite young.
Also fascinating, like when they actually later on, when they reduced the bounty to like 5 million, kind of to mess with him a little. I found it pretty funny.
That is true. This happens later on when they sort of drop the bounty and it just infuriates him. And it was all done for psychological purposes to say, you're not so important. And it did rattle him. It was funny.
How did the U.S. finally found him?
So just to collapse a little bit of history here. So the invasion takes place. Zarqawi, as he predicted, was waiting for the Americans in Baghdad. And even though he was a foreigner, he was a Jordanian, so he was not a Iraqi, he was able to bring together al-Qaeda wannabes, sort of radical young men, but also disaffected Iraqis, members of the army who had been sent home, members of the intelligence service who lost their jobs because when the U.S. came in, they essentially disbanded the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'athist Party is everybody. It was like being a communist in the Soviet Union times. Mm-hmm. You had to be a member of the party in order to be anybody, including like a high school gym teacher. But probably was one of the most probably misguided decisions that the U.S. forces made in that period was to completely disband these Ba'athists. So what happens is Zarqawi is able to bring together a pretty powerful group of people who hate the Americans and want to see them pushed out. And then he starts a campaign of terror. He goes after everybody who could be helpful to the Americans, who could give the American occupation some cover of legitimacy. Red Cross, the UN, other embassies, including Arab embassies like the Jordanian embassies. He systematically, bombed one after another and drove everybody who could be helpful to the United States out of the country. And then he set out to ignite a war between Sunni and Shiites, very deliberately exasperating these old tensions and inflaming them by like blowing up Shiite schools and mosques and marketplaces and killing people until there was such a frenzy of hatred and retribution and death that, Iraq essentially became convulsed in a civil war. All of that made Zarqawi extremely important to the Americans. He's somebody who had caused them no end of trouble. He was the subject of many conversations at the White House up to the president himself, just like, how do we get this guy? And he kept slipping through the Americans' fingers time after time. They would get a lead on him. They would send out patrols or helicopters to try to catch him or kill him. Every time he managed to slip away. And this went on for 3 years until finally, in June of 2006, the Americans got a really big break, which is they figured out the identity of a man who was one of Zarqawi's religious advisors, as we spoke about before. And once they had him figured out, they knew his identity, they monitored him and they just tracked it everywhere he went. And on one particular day in June of 2006, he takes a drive up to this Bakr, which is this town up just toward northeast of Baghdad. And, the sensors and the monitoring that's going on is they're able to detect that he's meeting with someone who sure looks a lot like Zarqawi. This man comes out and he fits him to a T. And so the United States, dispatches a pair of F-16s to drop bombs on the house. And they struck their target, and Zarqawi is pulled from the rubble of his safe house, still alive, barely. He was able to look into the eyes of the Americans that captured him, and he died there on the scene within just surrounded by American Special Forces operatives.
Yeah, that's not the way he wanted to go, I'm sure. What happened after that? Like there was some period of that group almost like dying down slowly, right?
Yeah.
What was happening then?
Yeah. So between that moment in 2006 and 2008-9, so this is a very critical period. So the Al-Qaeda in Iraq is leaderless, or at least it doesn't have this charismatic, rock star, figure at the helm. And also at the same time, the Americans are getting much smarter at counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, in the sense that you have this one general, Stanley McChrystal, who's running special forces, and he's relentless. They figure out that, okay, well, we find this Al-Qaeda figure over here, we roll up this safe house. The very same night we exploit all the intelligence we found, cell phones, maps, notes, whatever documents we recover from a raid, and go out after another the same night, and maybe 2 or 3 in the same night. And they continue this relentless tempo, and we're gradually just grinding down the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, getting the number 2s and the number 3s and the lieutenants out in the field. And within a couple of years, this thing that Zarqawi created was still existed. But as the CIA described at the time, it was operationally broken. They essentially had degraded it to such a degree that it was no longer able to function as a terrorist group, and it went deep underground. And once again, it was this moment in history where things seemed to be finally moving the right direction. This terrible group was no longer such a problem, and then the American withdrawal took place in 2011, and that allowed things to change, and the pendulum swung back in the other direction.
And I remember, I'm not sure if it relates to this episode. Americans withdrew because George Bush was told that everything is going fine, right, in Iraq, except King Abdullah tried to raise his hand, saying like, "No, there is resurgences in there." And
Yeah.
I think at least Cheney, I believe, she was in there. She told him to kind of keep his mouth shut, basically.
Yeah. Abdullah the King, who's really an extraordinary figure. And he often appears in this story and in real life as sort of a Cassandra, because he knows the region better than, pretty much anyone. He knows what these groups are like because he has experience from dealing with them himself. But he also understands the West and he understands the Americans very well. And he kept, trying to intervene at the right moment, saying, "Look, this is maybe not a smart move, or you should rethink this or do it in a different way." And most of the times he was ignored. But in this particular case, there was American public opinion had completely swung away from, seeing any justification in remaining in Iraq. It's a very unpopular war. There didn't seem to be any point in it. It was Sunnis and Shiites killing each other. What were we doing in the middle of this? And it had become fairly quiet. We managed to pacify the place enough so that Americans were no longer dying. It seemed to be on a good trajectory. And so George W. Bush negotiated an agreement with the Iraqi government to pull out completely. There had been some discussion, well, we should probably keep maybe a reserve there or a training capacity or some way to kind of keep an investment in the country. But that was rejected, and instead there was a complete withdrawal that took place in 2011. And predictably, things went south after that. The schisms that were there when we were also present really tore apart, and Sunnis and Shia began kind of killing each other again. And Zarqawi's children, his offspring, this group that was had almost fallen apart, suddenly had new life, had a new reason to exist, which was to fight against this oppressive Shiite government in Baghdad.
Let's enter the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Who is this figure and how did he come to power?
So his trajectory is really interesting because he's one of these many thousands of young Iraqis who are incensed by the American occupation and want to do something about it. He's not a sort of a typical fighter. He's more of he was a university student. He studied sort of Islamic jurisprudence, essentially sort of the legal underpinnings of Sharia law. That was his specialty, and he had a PhD. He was a learned person, but he got involved in one of these little Zarqawi groups in the mid 2000s, and then gets captured fairly quickly and sent to prison. So the Americans put him in this huge warehouse down in the south of Iraq called Camp Bucca. It was this massive outdoor prison, with huts where people would live, but, sometimes, 10,000 people on the roof. It's a holding cell essentially for the Americans, but it also for the jihadis becomes kind of a university for them because they were able to network, to recruit people, to look around and see who might be good for us when they get out of jail. And Baghdadi emerges as someone who seems to have credentials and potential. So he gets tapped. He becomes part of the leadership of al-Qaida in Iraq. And after Zarqawi's death, he quickly rises to a senior position as sort of a senior religious figure within the organization. And there's a period of turmoil where a couple leaders of this group get killed in counterterrorism strikes, and Baghdadi emerges as the sole leader. By 2011, he's in charge of the whole organization, and he's someone with ambition. He doesn't want to be just a small terrorist group nibbling around the edges. He wants to become really important. And so he begins doing Zarqawi-like things, the same kinds of brutal, shocking, terror attacks, executions, all the things that made Zarqawi famous. He embraces with his entirety, and he becomes this really dangerous, brutal, deadly leader in his own right.
There is a discussion of him actually, ISIS creating this full structure with recruiting, with the media team, etc., etc. How organized were they, and where did they get funding from? This
was the genius of what became known as ISIS. By the time Baghdadi was in power, they changed their name because they didn't want to be al-Qaida in Iraq. They wanted to be a true Iraqi organization. And so they changed their name to the Islamic State of Iraq. And you add one more letter to the end of this, Islamic State and Iraq and Syria, or al-Sham is the Arabic term, and you've got ISIS, which comes later on. But the genius of this revived group is that they really understood the value of organization, of finance, of structure, and then understood that instinctively because their top leadership were all people from the former Iraqi intelligence services and military, people who knew how to run organizations, knew how to control people, knew what it took logistically to run a big operation. And so that is the structure that he built. And by the time the Americans were gone, and by the time that Iraq had started to slip into this new period of insurgency and violence, ISIS had a really slick organization, and they were in a position where they could move quickly and potentially even take territory. And that's where we see them in 2011, when, just again by historical happenstance, the entire Middle East is erupting in something we called Arab Spring, which became just a perfect opportunity for ISIS to explode into something on a different level.
And so they benefited from Syria's turmoil, right? And that's where they rose to power. The money that they were able to generate, what was that money used for? Was it enriching somebody within the organization, or it was primarily used for recruitment and terrorist attacks?
ISIS's model for financing is a little bit different from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had charity organizations, and I'm using figurative quote marks here, because they were allied with groups who kind of positioned themselves as Muslim charities and would collect money that then gets funneled into the coffers of Al-Qaeda for its international operations. ISIS, kind of taking inspiration from the thug Zarqawi, the gangster Zarqawi, acquires its money in a different way, through shakedowns, through extortion, through robbing banks, robbing stores, or when they were able to move into territories and take over towns, imposing taxes, more shakedowns, all the sort of illicit ways to make money. It's just pretty much how their finances started flowing in the beginning. Later on, when they take over half of Iraq and Syria, they've got entire bank accounts and bank vaults and huge amounts of currency and gold and jewelry and whatever else you could imagine. But once they sort of tapped into that kind of money, then it's a very organized, very structured purchase of the things you need to run a state or to have an army. ISIS needs guns, it needs ammunition, it needs vehicles, it needs gas. And so it's systematically, because of its bureaucratic nature, set out to kind of purchase it or acquire all those things. And by 2014, when ISIS was really at its peak, money was no object. They had more money than they could spend in any of their lifetimes. They had enough to run a government and to give government support, pay salaries, collect trash. It's just incredible how sophisticated it became at that time. And it was again partly because the people within the upper ranks of the organization knew how to run an organization, and they figured it out quite efficiently.
How would you describe a typical ISIS fighter? Why did they join, and what was the typical profile of such person?
Yeah, and I've spent some time looking at various ones and spoken to a number as well. And you see a couple of different profiles. One is the locals, the ones who got involved because they saw this organization as their salvation from people they didn't like. I was thinking of one right now who was a bureaucrat in the city of Mosul, which is the second biggest city in Iraq, gets taken over by ISIS. He's not sure what's going to happen. What are these new people going to be like? And then he sees them persecuting his Shiite neighbors who he really hated. And he sees them collecting or picking up this big pile of trash that had been sitting at the end of the street for a long time. He hears them talking about conservative Islamic values that resonate with him. And so he begins to see them as these are the good guys. These are the guys we've always needed. We needed somebody who can clear out all these corrupt Muslim leaders, particularly Shiites who we hate anyway, who can push aside the influence of the West, the Americans in particular, who we hate anyway. And so he saw them as being, it's like George Washington or the U.S. cavalry coming in. He was just excited to be part of it. So that's one model. The other is the ones who came from overseas, the ones who came from abroad. And a lot of them bought into this idea of an Islamic caliphate revived, that they felt collectively as Muslims that they their history had been stolen from them, their culture had been stolen from them, they had been colonialized. The United States and the European countries had stolen their oil and not compensated them properly, and then inflicted their culture upon them. And there is a lot of resentment, even among educated Muslims in some parts of the world, about how they have fared as a civilization. And so a lot of people, including educated people, looked at this ISIS experiment as the real thing and wanted to support it any way they can. So some of them uprooted their families, moved wife and kids down to Raqqa in Syria or to Mosul to be part of it. And then once they got there, most, I think, would say they found it pretty disillusioning, because ISIS in practice is not nearly what it looked like on its promotional videos.
What was the demise of it? And do you think ISIS, like, would you name the book today as Rise and Fall of ISIS? Because when you finish it, it was still booming. Yeah,
that's right. It ends sort of as a cliffhanger with these black-robed, long-haired, bearded figures, running an area the size of England, and that was a pretty scary moment for the world. So yeah, if I were to do it again or to add a sequel, it would be the fall of, because it did fall pretty spectacularly and pretty quickly. And the reason it fell was because ISIS was so hated, so universally despised because of the things that it did, that everybody wanted to see this thing crushed. I mean, almost everybody. You end up getting 86 countries from around the world, including most of the Muslim world, signing up to be part of this military coalition that's going to go in and destroy this thing called ISIS. And so that happens, and you see it beginning in late 2015 to 2016, then finally in early 2019 with the last little pockets of the caliphate being fully crushed. So that's the fall. But I would add to that, though, that it's not the end of the story necessarily, because we might end up writing a story that goes through the rise and the fall and the rebirth, because the circumstances still exist in this region for this group to come back in some form. It may not be called the same thing. It may be different leadership. It may be worse than what we knew before. But we have in Syria, where the government in Damascus doesn't control the country. There's huge parts of the country that are essentially lawless. And that's how the combination of lawless, vacuums and lots of weapons and lots of, aggrieved, radicalized people, that was the fuel that gave ISIS its life. Those conditions still exist. In some ways, they're worse, because now you've had in Syria 12 years of civil war. You have a whole generation of young people who grew up without any real hope for the future. Their cities are in ruins. There's no aid. There's no education. And then you look to the east of Syria, where there's these massive holding camps for ISIS refugees. Some are ISIS fighters. They're in prison, but there are thousands and thousands of young people who grew up in the caliphate, who were born in the caliphate, who don't have a passport from anywhere else, and nobody knows what to do with them. And it's one of the most alarming to me, international problems that we face is, like, if somebody doesn't figure out a solution to problems like that and figure out ways to redirect these very large numbers of people into having useful lives, they're only going to be potential recruits for some group. If it's not called ISIS, it'll be called something else. So I guess the bottom line is the story isn't quite finished as far as I can see.
So maybe one important question is here. So, like, if you ask a Westerner what's the stereotypical terrorist look like, it would be described as a Middle Eastern Muslim man, right?
Yeah.
But it hasn't been this way, like, previously, maybe the last 50 years. Prior to that, it would be like Irish from the Iron Republican, whatever they call it. Like, what happened in this 50 years? What's the origin of this radicalization of Islam?
Yeah, and you're right. So it's more typically we've seen terrorists look like other things. And I'm actually spending a lot of time recently looking at the terrorists of the 70s and 80s, and many of them were quite secular. Some were Marxist. Some of them they saw themselves as men of the world who liked their liquor and good times. So very different from the folks we see in ISIS. But in our time, and really this is going back to the middle of the last century, there's been this sort of wave of Islamist extremism that has its own peculiar origin. I trace a lot of it back, if you want to, they're sort of the inspirational godfather of these groups like Al-Qaida and ISIS, was an Egyptian man. His name is Sayyid Qutb. He was a writer and philosopher who wrote a couple of seminal books that encapsulated a view that was coming into vogue at the time in some parts of the intellectual Muslim world, which is that because of the West, the real Islam had ceased to exist, that the West had essentially destroyed their religion, and that the only way to get our birthright back is to violently fight back against corrupt leaders who run our governments. It's like the Egyptian leaders in particular, in Qutb's case, or Muslim leaders everywhere. And his books and his sermons were kind of a call to arms that we have to wake up Muslims. We have to reject modernity. We reject Muslim values, and we have to arm ourselves and fight to overthrow this corruption and to bring true Islamic values back. And he excited a whole generation of Islamist intellectuals, but he also became the direct inspiration for people like Osama bin Laden and people like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who became the later Al-Qaeda leader. Zarqawi, his movement was influenced by these same ideas. Zarqawi was probably not smart enough to read any of these Kutub texts, but he got the sense. And so you see them, espousing this extremism and violence, and also doing it symbolically in ways that kind of harken back to that Muslim past, that mythical Muslim past that they want to create. And in that sense, there truly are sort of children of Qutb and that thinking that came out of the 1950s. And I must say that one thing about Qutb that's fascinating is he spent a lot of time in the United States. He came to the U.S. as a student, and he was so offended by sort of the U.S. sexual permissiveness. And this is the 1950s, so hardly is what it is now. But it just really insulted him to his core. And so he comes back to Egypt thinking that these people, these Westerners, are so decadent that we can have nothing to do with them. And so he was a part of his theory of how to change the world is to kind of destroy that, or at least get it so far removed from where most Muslims are, because it's a cancer. It's something that will destroy us, and we have to get away from it. And that's where culturally a lot of these people come from, and that's why we see them with the beards and all the sort of trappings of medieval Islam, because that's what they're hearkening back to.
You wrote several books, right? In what order should people read your books?
So you're very, very kind. And I hope I have a fourth one. I'm working on one now. I haven't announced it yet because I'm still trying to make sure that it works in concept. But it's what I love to do, because it's nothing that's more rewarding as somebody who's always been a journalist and a writer is getting a chance to tell a big story on a big canvas instead of the daily news that gets consumed and then goes away. The easiest book, I think, is the first one. If you're just looking for something that's it's not a very long read, but it's a story, it's a spy story. It's called The Triple Agent, and all my books are what we call narrative nonfiction, which means they're absolutely accurate historical accounts of things that happen. But I tend to, because just the way I like to think and write is I tend to tell the story of people and then really get into the detail to kind of recreate their world and their lives. And that takes just a ton of reporting, but then it makes it read more like a novel. So you're reading a story and not like a historical tome about events. So this first book tells a story about a failed CIA operation in 2009, and listeners may remember some of this, but there was, right just between Christmas and New Year's in 2009, a agent, somebody we thought was on our side, had been in the Al-Qaeda world in Pakistan, gives the U.S. information that makes them think that they potentially have Osama bin Laden. They could get him. And he was sort of number one wanted person in the world. So this is very exciting news. This agent comes into a secret U.S. base in Afghanistan wearing a bomb under his cloak, blows himself up and kills 7 Americans and a couple others who were there at the meeting. The deadliest day in CIA history since one other incident in the 1980s when an embassy was bombed. The story is called Triple Agent because the key figure is a Jordanian, as it turns out, who was a professional. He was a trained pediatrician. He was spoke English. He was someone we would certainly recognize and feel like is not that foreign to us, but became so incensed and so radicalized by the situation in the Palestine area, in Gaza specifically, which we're thinking about right now, that he becomes an online radical and then gets recruited to being spy. But essentially, it's flipping back and forth between the Americans and the Jordanians and Al-Qaeda nobody knows what side he's really on until the very end when he walks into a meeting and kills a bunch of Americans with a bomb. So it's 70,000 word, fairly self-contained story that happens within a year. Just essentially getting into the story of this really unusual spy turned terrorist, and the efforts eventually unsuccessful by the Americans to figure him out and to harness his capabilities and his access into this great operation to get bin Laden. So that was number one. That happened just before bin Laden was killed. In fact, I had to update it as I was finishing the book to include the death of bin Laden at the end, who they actually did finally get. Second is Black Flags, we've talked about today, which is the backstory of the Islamic State, again told as a character-driven story, looking at the founding figures, particularly Zarqawi. And then in 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic, I came out with a book called Red Line. It's the story of how in the middle of the Syrian civil war, the Americans and the international community suddenly were confronted with the fact that there were thousands of tons of deadly chemical weapons in Syria, and Syria was using them, and most famously in August of 2013 when they killed 1,400 people in a single terrorist attack involving sarin. After Syria agreed to give up its chemical weapons, we had to figure out a way to get them out before ISIS or Al-Qaida could get them, and both those groups wanted chemical weapons. And so it's this race against time to get out the stockpile of weapons in the middle of a civil war and then destroy them at sea before somebody could figure out how to use them in a bad way. So it's a bit of there's a lot of so the technical aspects come into play, but it's partly a spy story, and it just kind of a race to get some really bad things out of a bad area before the whole world blew up. So those are my three books, and I'm happy to chat about any of them sometime. So I really appreciate your interest.
Joby, thank you very much for being on the podcast. It was a fantastic discussion.
This is a great discussion for me. It's not always that I talk to people who grasp the issues as well as you do and have actually read the book as well. And I just appreciate a chance to have a very literate and very interesting conversation with you. So thank you.